the excretory system. So we're going to be looking at urine formation and osmoregulation. So excretion, as what we're going to be talking about, is the removal of cellular waste. So we're not talking about egestion or digestion or our digestive system. We are specifically talking about cellular waste products. So as our cells are going through metabolism of various sorts, they're going to be producing wastes. One of them we know is carbon dioxide, and we can get rid of that through our lungs, but other ones like the nitrogen containing waste products that we get through protein digestion, we can't breathe that out, and so we need to have a way of excreting that stuff. So we're not talking about the undigested food like cellulose, that's egestion. We are talking about cellular waste products. So we need to excrete this stuff for many different reasons. Maintaining homeostasis is sort of the main reason here. One of the main things we're going to be talking about is getting rid of those nitrogenous wastes that develop through the breakdown of protein. And so ammonia is one of the products that we get when we break down proteins, which is an important part of our metabolism, but it itself is highly toxic. So we have to have a way of getting rid of this ammonia. Other things are also going to be done through excretion, such as osmoregulation and getting rid of excess sodium ions or any just ions in general. So osmoregulation is going to be another big part of it. But we're going to definitely look at nitrogenous waste products as well as some other metabolic waste products. So fish, they are in direct contact with their aqueous environment, the water that they're in. So when they produce ammonia, just as we do when they're breaking down their proteins, they're going to be able to get rid of that ammonia directly from their blood, which is in direct contact through cellular walls with the water. So it can diffuse directly into the water. Land animals that aren't surrounded by water and their blood system is not in contact with an aqueous environment, we have to get rid of our ammonia elsewhere. So things like birds and reptiles that have spent a significant portion of their early life in an egg, they have developed a way of putting that waste product into uric acid. It's a solid, as you've seen on your car, I'm sure. And so that stores well while they're stuck in that egg and they don't die of the toxic effects of those waste products. The other animals, though, that are fortunate enough not to be in an egg for a long period of time, they don't need to turn it into uric acid, though that is one option. But things like mammals, who actually had a mother to take care of their waste for them while they were developing, they are able to convert that to urea, which is less toxic than ammonia. So we maintain it in our body for a while, but we still need to get rid of that urea. So we're going to look at that process as to how the kidneys do that. So the excretory system itself, we're going to be focusing on the action of the kidneys. It is essentially the filter for our blood, but obviously if we're filtering things out of our blood, we've got to be able to get rid of them as well. So we have our ureters, our urinary bladder, and our urethra, which are essentially the pathway to get rid of those waste products that the kidneys filter out. So about 1,800 liters of blood pass through the kidneys, and this is essentially in a 24-hour period. 180 liters of filtrate are created. So as the blood moves through the kidneys, about 180 liters of that fluid, not the blood itself, but the fluid from within the blood, are going to pass into the kidneys, into the filtrate. Now, obviously, you don't pee out 180 liters of urine a day, so most of that is absorbed back into the body. About a liter of that, much of the stuff that we want to get rid of, is actually excreted. And so the process of understanding how the excretory system works is essentially how do you take 180 liters out of your blood and then put back in 179 and get rid of 1. That's essentially what the job of the kidneys are to do. So just put in context the location of the kidneys. So you've got 2 of them, and they sort of sit on either side of your spine, sort of near the bottom of your spine there, underneath your rib cage, and they're toward the back side there on either side of your spine. So that's the physical location of them. The structure of the kidney itself looks kind of like a kidney bean, as you would imagine, and so there's essentially a blood pathway into the kidney. So that is our renal, referring to kidney, renal artery, meaning the blood is going in through that direction. And often we do those in red. And then we do our renal veins in blue, showing the blood coming back out. So there's blood going in and blood coming back out, circulating through the kidney. And again, that's our 1,800 liters of blood doing that. Some of that fluid that is in the blood is going to be removed from it, 180 liters, most of which makes it back in. So it comes out of the blood and then goes back into the blood and then circulates through the body. About 1 liter will actually pass into the ureter, and then that's what we're actually forming the urine from. So here's another structure of it. Some of the structures and parts that we're going to be mentioning. The cortex, so this is sort of like the outer layer, and it sort of folds over like that. And then the inner part, medulla, of the kidney itself. So we're going to be talking about the structures that go between the cortex and the medulla. And eventually it's going to be producing these little structures called nephrons, are going to be producing what starts out as the filtrate, the fluid from the blood. A lot of that gets put back into the blood, but eventually end up with urine, which is going to make its way out of the kidney, through the ureter, into the bladder, through the urethra, and then hopefully into the toilet. Functions of the kidney itself. Again, removal of waste is sort of their main function. So these wastes, big one is the nitrogenous waste products like urea. Uric acid is another one of those. And it will take those waste products out of the blood and excrete them. It is also going to be regulating ion concentration, so things like sodium ions and calcium ions, and getting rid of excess ones that we have in our blood, but making sure we have enough in them as well. And conservation of water is huge in the function of the kidney as well. Blood pressure is going to be related to that. So we'll see how the regulation of water is also going to have an effect on the blood pressure and how hormones are able to control that. So again, location-wise, we have blood flowing into either kidney through going through the abdominal aorta, but then moving in through the renal artery, going through all of the blood vessels within the kidney itself, and then making an exit through the renal vein, and then continuing its circulation through the inferior vena cava. So we're going to be focusing on, once it is in the kidney, what's going on with that blood flow, and specifically once the filtrate is removed from the blood, how is the process and the flow of those substances in the filtrate being reabsorbed and ultimately put back into the blood or excreted. So again, we have our kidneys, and they are producing the urine, which is then going to go through our ureter into our bladder, and then through our urethra out into the environment. The renal artery is how the blood is getting in there. It is being processed by millions of tiny structures called nephrons. So we're going to focus on how one nephron works, but it's important that you realize it's not like there is a nephron in the kidney. There are like 1 million nephrons per kidney. And again, we're talking about those nephrons going from the cortex to the medulla and back again, and then back again, and then back again. There are many blood vessels that are associated with these nephrons. So the nephrons themselves look like this. And so they are essentially a one-directional path that is connecting from the blood, which is being pumped through the kidney, and then it is a one-way pathway that sort of goes through this long loop and eventually leads to the ureter. So, and then we have the bladder and the urethra and out. But we're going to be focusing on these nephrons. We'll again look at one of them, but realize that there are 1 million nephrons-ish per kidney. So here's a more clear view. Often we will be looking at them by themselves, but it's important to realize that they are all packed together. So you've got all sorts of different ones all packed in close together. And again, fluid is, and water and ions are going to be moving in and out of these nephrons. And again, mostly out, because we want to go from 180 liters down to 1. And so that fluid is picked up by the capillaries that are going around the nephron. So often we will see it without the blood vessels drawn around it, but obviously the fluid's going to be leaving those nephrons. It's got to be absorbed into the bloodstream and carried back to the rest of the blood body. And so therefore it is constantly being surrounded by these capillaries. Don't forget that we will be looking at one nephron, but this is happening millions of times per kidney. So 3 stages of urine formation. First, and again here in blue, you can see the nephron itself. It starts with the glomerulus, and this is the beginning part of the actual nephron itself. It is where the fluid is taken out of the blood and begins its process of reabsorption, most of it anyways, and then the 1 liter that's left over, and again, not 1 liter per nephron, but 1 liter between all of the nephrons within the 2 kidneys, and that is where we get our 1 liter of urine. Solute reabsorption is going to happen along the pathway, so we're going to talk about where different solutes are being reabsorbed, as well as water, and essentially where it tends to be reabsorbed, but a lot of these are going to be happening in different places. When they get reabsorbed, they're going to be passed into the capillaries of the blood vessels surrounding these nephrons. So first step, glomerulus filtration. This is, again, the first step in urine formation, and this is where the plasma from the blood is essentially forced out of the blood into the nephron. So you can imagine if we had some arteries that are bringing the blood into the kidney, they're going to get smaller and smaller and break apart into different branches, and eventually we end up with an arteriole, so a small artery, and it is going towards the nephron, and so we call it the afferent arteriole. And then it goes into this structure called the glomerulus. It's sort of like this little ball of blood vessels, and eventually there's a out point, which is called the efferent arteriole. So blood's going in at the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus and coming out the efferent arteriole. Now, the blood is going in there, and the cells and the proteins and the large things like that are staying in the blood, but the fluid is able to be forced out of the blood into the first part of the nephron. And so the nephron is going to continue, and so the first part of it is called the proximal convoluted tubule. It's close and it's wiggly, so it's proximal convoluted, it's a tube, and so that's the first part of the nephron. And that is where the fluid of the blood is essentially removed from the blood, or a portion of it anyways. Essentially, pressure is what is driving that force. I just can think of this like a physical filter. And if you look at a picture of it, you can sort of see that the walls of these arterioles inside the glomerular capsule here is where the filter, the solution of the blood is coming out of the blood, but the large things would be stuck behind and remain in the blood. So essentially what this means is at the very start of the nephron, the fluid in it is essentially the plasma from the blood, the liquid part of the blood. So again, huge volume per day, 1,800 going through these things, so about 180 actually comes out. So it's not like all the fluid comes out of the blood, but a fair portion does. And so again, we basically have our ions, our sugars, our solutes, and water in there as well. And essentially this is where our waste is going to come out of the blood. Now obviously we can't just get rid of 180 liters of blood fluid a day, so we've got to get most of it back in without bringing those wastes back in. Hopefully this filtrate that we're taking out of the blood is protein free, and again, proteins being relatively large, or polypeptides being relatively large molecules, they hopefully will not make it through this filtrate as long as your kidney's functioning properly. One of the indicators of a kidney problem, though, is that these filters aren't properly filtering out, leaving the protein in the blood, and if the protein is able to get out, then it ends up in the urine. That's not a good sign. So again, glomerulus filtrate, huge, lots of it, and most of it needs to be brought back in because our urine, you're not peeing out 180 liters of pee a day, and so we've got to suck back in through our nephrons almost all of that fluid, leaving behind about 1 liter, which we can use to get rid of, which will hopefully contain all of the waste that we want to get rid of, and the amount of water that we also want to get rid of as well. So second step, solute reabsorption. That 180 liters, we can't let go of it. We've got to get, it's got all sorts of good things that we need back into our body. And so things like sodium and chloride ions and glucose are going to be transported from the filtrate back into the blood. And so the first part of the nephron is the glomerulus, and that is where the fluid is coming out of the blood. The filtrate is coming out of the blood, and it's going to pass into the first part of our second part. The glomerulus is the first part. The proximal tubule, convoluted tubule, is the second part. And so as the filtrate's passing through there, pumps are taking that stuff that we want back into our body and moving it back into the bloodstream. So there's going to be a lot of active transport happening here, meaning you need lots of energy. So you got lots of mitochondria there as well, using up lots of ATP to pump all of that good stuff back into our blood. And again, leaving some of it behind in the filtrate. Step 3, the water reabsorption. So this is going to take place in the what's called the descending loop of Henle. And if we bring up a picture, well, we will bring up a picture in a minute, we'll see what this loop of Henle looks like. But again, during the descending part of the loop of Henle, there's one portion that is going down, so we call it the descending loop of Henle, and this is also going to happen again during collecting ducts that we'll see. So after the solutes have been taken out of the filtrate through that active pumping action, what's going to happen is that the filtrate is now hypotonic. So compared to the blood around those tubules, the filtrate is going to be hypotonic. Therefore, water is going to move out of the tubule, which is good, right? Because we don't want to get rid of 180 liters of it. And so we've got to not only bring those solutes back in through that active pumping, but we've got to bring water back in. So we're talking about this from the frame of reference of the nephron, the tube that leads to the outside. So when we say out of the tubule, we mean out of the filtrate back into the blood. It is reabsorbed. So here's a good picture of what is happening. We have essentially the proximal tubule. So remember, we've got our glomerulus and our proximal tubule, where we have all that pumping back in. And so as that filtrate is passing down, so this loop right here is called the loop of Henle. And as it is passing through the first part of the loop of Henle, the descending part of the loop of Henle, it is moving from the cortex down into the medulla. So the cortex on the outer part of the kidney, the medulla on the inside part of the kidney. It is passing from the cortex into the medulla, and water is going to be reabsorbed along the way. And so what that's going to do is, the numbers on here show the solute concentration of the filtrate and of the interstitial fluid, the cellular cells around the actual nephron here, as they pass through the medulla. You can see that this concentration goes from 300 here in the cortex to very, very concentrated, like 1200 in the lower parts of the medulla. So there's lots of ions down in this part here, deep in the medulla. And because of that, the water is going to want to move out of the filtrate into the medulla, basically the interstitial fluid, the cells of the medulla, and therefore it is leaving the filtrate. And so since the water is leaving, you can see that the filtrate's concentration starts off low, and because you're sucking out all the water, it ends up high as well. Then the filtrate's going to begin its trip up the ascending loop portion of the loop of Henle, and while that is happening, we're having active transport of ions as well. So we want those ions back in, and so we're going to actively transport them back through. And while this is happening, water is not able to re-enter the tubules, and so essentially the portion of it is impermeable to water on the ascending portion here. Then we pass through the cortex again, and the collecting tubule. So after we've gone through the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, and then the loop of Henle, the last part of the nephron is called the collecting tubule, and this is where they actually start to meet up, and the fluid from other loop of Henles are going to be joining together. So you'd have other ones coming in here as well, and they'd be joining up kind of like branches of a tree. And so while they're going through the collecting tubule, while the filtrate is going through the collecting tubule, it's passing back down through the more concentrated medulla, and therefore more water is able to be reabsorbed out of the filtrate. So the urine itself is decreasing in volume, and be reabsorbed back into the body, into the bloodstream. So water can be regulated at the point of the kidneys by essentially controlling how much water is going to be reabsorbed out of the filtrate. Remember, lots of fluid is going to be starting in the filtrate, and then it gets reabsorbed. So if we reabsorb less, then the filtrate, which becomes the urine, has more water in it. If we reabsorb more water out of that filtrate, then the urine has less water in it. So this is a means of controlling osmoregulation in the body. So we use a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, which is secreted by the pituitary gland up in your brain, gets into the bloodstream, makes its way down to the kidney, and is going to be changing how much water is reabsorbed in those collecting ducts. This stimulus of antidiuretic hormone is an increase, and I'm putting square brackets to refer to concentration of, so an increased concentration of sodium ions in the blood. Having too many ions, you eat like a whole pizza or something like that, you've got lots of sodium ions in your blood, and your brain's going to pick up on that. Your pituitary gland is going to release some antidiuretic hormone, and then we can allow that osmoregulation to take place. So ADH, how it works is it increases the reabsorption of water. So again, we can allow the water to be excreted into our urine, or we could reabsorb more of it, and it's going to happen because of this ADH. How essentially it works is by increasing the permeability of the distal tubules. So remember, your nephron is starting with your glomerulus, and then you have your proximal convoluted tubule, and then you have your loop of Henle, and you have your distal convoluted tubule, and your collecting ducts. And so this distal tubule here, then on the way out, where it's sort of meeting up with other nephrons, it is going to be able to change the permeability of water reabsorption there. If it's more permeable to water, more water gets reabsorbed. If it's less permeable, less water gets reabsorbed. And again, this can also has an effect on ADH, also has an effect on vasoconstriction, which constricts your blood vessels, leading to higher blood pressure as well. So too much of ADH, it causes increased volume in blood, which again would also lead to higher blood pressures as well, because if you think ADH is a hormone that increases the permeability of the distal tubules, meaning you get rid of less water, meaning you have more water, and therefore your blood itself has more water in it, larger blood volume, therefore higher blood pressure. If it gets to the point where it is too high, this can also lead to dilute ion concentration. One of the signs of that is muscle twitching. So regulation of urine concentration and volume from the perspective of ADH. So in the scenario where you have low ADH, the distal convoluted tubule, remember we have our Bowman's capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, not really well drawn here, and then you have loop of Henle, and then you have the distal convoluted tubule, it's the one that's further away from where the start was. And again, this is where we're talking about the permeability of it. And so low ADH hormone means the ducts are impermeable, meaning the water is not going to be reabsorbed. So water could be reabsorbed from those distal tubules, but if they're not permeable, then they don't get reabsorbed. And then you have dilute urine, lots of water in the urine. If you have high ADH, and one of the triggers for that would be, say, lots of sodium in the blood, your brain will start producing more, or pituitary gland will start producing more ADH, and this will cause them to become permeable, allowing water to be reabsorbed, and therefore the urine itself would be less dilute, and you'd have that water instead in your blood. So, summary of this effect, and again you can see the negative feedback loop that we're doing to maintain homeostasis. So the concentration of water in the blood, let's say, decreases, and again, you eat a whole bunch of salt, that's going to happen. It's not that you have less water necessarily, but you have more ions in it, so it's like saying the concentration of water is decreased, or the concentration of ion has increased, same thing. This increase in the hypertonicity, so how many ions are in your blood, stimulates the osmoreceptors, so this particular cells that pick up the concentration of ions in your blood in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland to start pumping out some ADH into your bloodstream. It's going to flow through your bloodstream to your kidneys. The ADH is going to work on those distal convoluted tubules, causing them to increase their water reabsorption, making them more permeable to collecting water back out of the filtrate. And then the urine itself becomes more concentrated, the blood becomes less concentrated, more water in the blood, and then this would feed back on those osmoreceptors and say, okay, we've got more water now in our blood, and so we can stop producing as much ADH, and we have a negative feedback loop. The inability to produce sufficient amounts of ADH, this is one type of a cause of one type of diabetes. So this is insipidus, and this causes or has the symptoms of increased thirst and increased dilute urine, because again, you're not producing the ADH, which so therefore you're not reabsorbing the water back into your blood. So you're essentially, your body is not able to save as much water as it should. But it can be treated with ADH hormone, which would then cause your body to reabsorb the proper amount, assuming dosage was correct, of water. If you drink lots of water, the blood volume is going to be high, your sodium ion concentration is low, and therefore your ADH secretions are going to be slowed down. Alcohol and caffeine are what's known as diuretics because they inhibit ADH. And so if you inhibit ADH, then you don't have the increase in permeability of those distal convoluted tubules, and therefore you have more loss of water, less reabsorption of water, and therefore an increase in urine volume. Here is an example of some of the ways that we have in the past diagnosed problems based on urine. Since the urine is produced from the plasma of the blood, when there's something wrong in the body, it's often able to be diagnosed through the content, or what is or is not present in the urine. So for example, if there's a high blood pressure, some of those proteins can actually get through the glomerulus into the filtrate, and you end up with protein in the urine. So that's one of the ways to test for high blood pressures, by looking for that damage to the kidneys caused by the high blood pressure, allowing those proteins to escape. So this has been a means of doing diagnostic tests for a very long time, long before we were able to actually get the diagnosis done in the blood. We were able to get an idea of what was going on in the body by what the body itself was excreting.